Everyone in town knew Officer Bradley. He wasn't the kind of man who blended into the background, carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed the entire world owed him respect. The way he strolled through diners, the way he leaned on his patrol car at gas stations, and the way he interrupted conversations with nothing more than his presence, it was all calculated. People whispered that he wasn't just an officer. He was the law itself. Or at least that's what he wanted them to believe. His badge didn't just hang on his chest. It was his weapon, his armor, his justification for everything he did. Bradley pulled people over. It wasn't about enforcing the law. It was about dominance. He enjoyed the way drivers' hands trembled on steering wheels, the way parents hushed their children in the back seat, the way eyes darted nervously too. Mirrors. He would take his time, drawing out the silence before speaking, letting the weight of his badge and gun do the talking. Some officers carry themselves with quiet professionalism, but Bradley wasn't one of them. He lived for that fear. He believed it made him untouchable. In the department, colleagues kept their distance. Nobody outright challenged him, but there was an unspoken truth. Bradley was dangerous not because he was the most skilled, but because he had learned to bend the system. He filed reports in ways that made him look like a hero. He stacked minor offenses into major ones with a twist of wording. If anyone dared question his actions, he would turn the suspicion back on them, reminding them he had friends in high places. Most decided it was easier to look away. After all, who wanted to be on the bad side of a man who treated his badge like a crown? But arrogance has a way of creating blind spots, and Bradley's were growing larger with each passing day. He didn't notice how some of the townspeople had begun whispering in coffee shops about his abuses. He didn't notice the weariness in the eyes of those who had been falsely ticketed or bullied into silence. He only saw compliance, and he mistook that compliance for admiration. Then came the night that would unravel everything. Bradley had been patrolling near an apartment complex, bored, restless, and itching for some display of authority. That was when he noticed a woman loading groceries into her car. She wasn't doing anything illegal, but she didn't bow her head when she saw him. She didn't give him the nervous glance he was used to. Instead, she gave him a polite nod and went about her business. That irritated him. Her name was Alicia Torres, though Bradley didn't know it yet. All he knew was that she had failed to show the proper respect, and in his mind, that was enough to make her a target. He approached, making up some nonsense about loitering and suspicious behavior. Alicia, tired after a long shift at the hospital, pushed back. She told him calmly that she lived there, that she was just putting away her groceries, and that he was wasting her time. That should have been the end of it. But Bradley wasn't used to resistance. The air thickened as their exchange grew tense. Alicia's voice carried strength, the kind that came from years of standing on her feet in emergency rooms, handling life and death while people like Bradley strutted around pretending to be powerful. When she told him that flashing a badge didn't give him the right to harass her, something inside him snapped. The humiliation of being challenged, and worse, being challenged in public where neighbors might overhear, burned like acid in his pride. He ticketed her for resisting, scribbling down exaggerated details to paint her as aggressive. Alicia didn't crumble. She took the ticket from his hand, looked him in the eye, and said, "This isn't justice. This is abuse." Words echoed louder than she realized. Bradley stormed off, but the sting of being called out gnawed at him all night, in his mind. Alicia wasn't just another citizen. She had become a threat to the fragile empire he had built on fear and intimidation. She'd got away with defying him. Others might follow. He couldn't allow that. So he escalated. A week later, Bradley filed a report claiming Alicia had interfered with police duty. He added details that never happened, that she had raised her voice aggressively, that she had made sudden movements, that he felt endangered by her behavior. To anyone reading the report, it sounded convincing. After all, Bradley had a history of credible arrests and reliable testimony. Judges trusted him, prosecutors relied on him, and most defendants never stood a chance against his word. But this time was different. Alicia wasn't like the others who had folded under pressure, too scared or too poor to fight back. She had seen enough in her career as a nurse to know what real courage looked like, and she refused to let Bradley's lies define her. When the court summons came, she didn't panic. Instead, she gathered her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced by his badge. Word spread quickly. Some whispered that Alicia was making a mistake, that Bradley always won, that going up against him was a losing battle. But others quietly cheered her on, hoping she would succeed where they hadn't. For the first time, Bradley had lit a spark of resistance in a community he had long kept in line. The day she walked into the courthouse, she wasn't alone. Friends, coworkers, and neighbors filled the gallery. Bradley arrived with his usual swagger, confident that this would be another easy win. He didn't even bother to hide his smirk as he glanced at Alicia, certain she would be crushed once the trial began. But Alicia wasn't the same woman he had confronted in that parking lot. She carried herself differently, now steady, unwavering, the quiet fire in her eyes. Bradley thought he had trapped her in his world, where his badge made him king. What he didn't realize was that Alicia was stepping into the fight fully, prepared and... The courthouse had always been Officer Bradley's theater. He strutted through those marble halls like they had been built for him alone, nodding to clerks, shaking hands with prosecutors, smirking at defense attorneys who hated him but never dared to challenge his authority. To him, every trial was just another performance, and he always believed he held the starring role. He had his script memorized, the lies sharpened to sound like truths, the body language perfected to radiate confidence. Judges had learned to trust him, and jurors usually hung on his every word. He expected this case against Alicia Torres to be no different. But the moment Alicia entered the courtroom, something shifted. She didn't walk in like a frightened defendant bracing for humiliation. She walked in like a woman who had spent her life facing crises and surviving them. Her friends, co-workers, and even a few strangers filled the benches in quiet support. Their presence wasn't loud or confrontational, but it carried weight. They weren't there for spectacle. They were there because they believed her. Bradley noticed the crowd, but he dismissed it with a sneer. In his mind, they would all be gone once he was finished tearing her apart. The judge entered, a tired man with silver hair and heavy glasses. He had seen countless cases of petty charges and bickering disputes. At first, he treated this one like any other, but Alicia's posture caught his eye. She sat tall, calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap, while Bradley leaned back in his chair, arms crossed with the smugness of a man who thought victory was inevitable. It was a small detail, but it set the tone for everything that followed. The prosecutor, who had worked with Bradley on dozens of cases, opened with confidence. He described Alicia as confrontational, aggressive, and uncooperative, painting a picture of a woman who thought she was above the law. Bradley sat there nodding along, occasionally glancing at the jurors as if to remind them that he was the expert, the enforcer, the one who kept order in the community. His uniform gleamed under the lights, the badge catching every reflection. Like a shield, then Alicia's attorney stood. He wasn't flashy. He didn't speak with grand gestures or booming rhetoric. He was calm, deliberate, and surgical with his words. His opening statement wasn't about painting Alicia as a saint. It was about asking questions that would soon start peeling away at Bradley's carefully constructed facade. "What happens when a badge becomes a weapon instead of a shield?" he asked quietly. "And what happens when an innocent citizen refuses to be bullied by the very system meant to protect her?" The courtroom fell into a tense silence. Bradley's smirk twitched, but he quickly covered it. He had seen lawyers try to be clever before, and he had crushed them all. With the same weapon, his testimony. When he took the stand, he slipped into his usual performance. He described the night in the parking lot with the confidence of a man telling a well-rehearsed story. He added small details: how Alicia's tone was hostile, how she made him feel unsafe, how her behavior escalated without warning. He even threw in the line he knew would sway the jury: "I was afraid for my safety." He had said those words before, and they had never failed him. But Alicia's attorney was patient. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He let Bradley speak, letting the officer pile detail upon detail, rope upon rope, until he had unknowingly tied a noose of contradictions around himself. Then came the cross-examination. "Officer Bradley," the attorney began, voice even, almost polite. "You've testified that Ms. Torres was aggressive. Could you describe what exactly she did that made you feel threatened?" Bradley straightened in his chair, repeating the same points he had written in his report. She had raised her voice. She had moved her hands in a way that made him uncomfortable. She had questioned his authority, and this all happened. Attorney continued, while she was placing grocery bags into her car. "Yes," Bradley replied firmly. The attorney let the answer hang for a moment before moving to the next question. "You also testified that she resisted your questioning. Did she refuse to provide identification when asked?" "No," Bradley admitted, but she was slow to comply. The attorney paced slowly, letting the jury absorb the answer. Slow to comply. "Officer Bradley, would you say it is unusual for a person, after finishing a long work shift, to take a moment before retrieving their wallet from a bag full of groceries?" Bradley hesitated. It was a small crack, but everyone in the courtroom felt it. The attorney pressed further. He brought up body camera footage. Bradley stiffened. He'd assumed the footage wouldn't be an issue. It often malfunctioned or missed key moments. But this time, the footage existed. And Alicia's attorney had filed a request early enough to secure it. The video played on the screen for the court to see. There was no aggressive Alicia, no sudden threatening movements, no raised voice that could be interpreted as dangerous. Instead, the jury saw a tired woman placing groceries into her car while a uniformed officer barked orders at her. She complied, though not immediately, because she had to set down a carton of milk and dig through her bag. The silence in the room as the footage rolled was deafening. Bradley's face tightened, but he tried to spin it. "As you can see," he said, "her body language was tense, her tone was sharp. I had reason to be on high alert." The attorney didn't argue. He simply replayed the clip of Alicia saying calmly, "I live here. I'm just putting away my groceries." The jury saw it for themselves, and the contrast to Bradley's report was glaring, piece by piece. The attorney dismantled Bradley's testimony. He pointed out inconsistencies between the report and the footage. Between Bradley's statements in court and his history in other cases, he subtly introduced the fact that multiple complaints had been filed against him in the past, though none had ever been pursued. Bradley tried to maintain his composure, but the cracks were spreading. Alicia's turn came to testify. She didn't give a fiery speech. She didn't beg for sympathy. She simply told the truth. She described her shift at the hospital, her exhaustion, and her confusion when Bradley approached her. She recounted how his tone shifted from questioning to accusatory, how he twisted her every word into defiance, how powerless she felt standing there under the glare of his badge. Her words were calm but firm, and the sincerity in her voice carried more weight than Bradley's bluster ever could. As she spoke, jurors leaned forward, listening intently. Some scribbled notes. Others glanced at Bradley with new suspicion. The more Alicia spoke, the smaller he seemed. By the time closing arguments came, the energy in the room had shifted completely. The prosecutor tried to salvage Bradley's credibility, but the damage was done. Alicia's attorney reminded the jury of the footage of the contradictions, of the simple question at the heart of the case: who was truly the aggressor, the citizen unloading groceries, or the officer who turned a quiet evening into a false charge? When the jury left to deliberate, Bradley sat rigid in his chair, the smugness gone. For the first time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: doubt. He tapped his fingers on the table, eyes darting to the door every time footsteps echoed in the hallway. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the jury returned. The foreman stood, voice steady. "We find the defendant, Alicia Torres, not guilty." A ripple of relief swept through the courtroom. Alicia closed her eyes, tears welling up, while her supporters quietly embraced one another. Bradley sat frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. He had lost. His badge hadn't saved him. His lies hadn't convinced them. The judge dismissed the case, but not before delivering a pointed remark. "Officer Bradley, this court reminds you that justice is not a tool for personal pride. Power of the badge carries responsibility, not immunity." The words struck harder than Bradley expected. As the room emptied, he felt the walls closing in. He had always thought the courtroom was his domain, but now it felt like enemy territory. He left quickly, avoiding the stares, the whispers, the quiet satisfaction on Alicia's face. What Bradley didn't realize yet was that this was only the beginning. The trial had exposed more than just his lies about one woman. It had cracked open a history of complaints and abuses that people had long been too afraid to voice. And Alicia, unknowingly, had lit the fire that would soon consume the illusion of his untouchable power. The weeks after the verdict were strangely quiet for Alicia. For the first time in months, she could walk through her neighborhood without the weight of suspicion pressing down on her. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stopped to greet her warmly, some apologizing for ever doubting her, others thanking her for standing firm against injustice. She accepted their words with humility, though deep down she knew the real victory was not just her own. Something larger had shifted, something that reached beyond her case. But for Officer Bradley, the silence was deafening. He expected the department to rally behind him, as they always had. Instead, he was greeted with cool stares and whispered conversations that ended abruptly when he walked into a room. His colleagues, once eager to stand at his side, now avoided him. A handful of officers had quietly started distancing themselves, worried that his name had become a stain on the department's reputation. The Internal Affairs Division launched an inquiry almost immediately. The body cam footage had done more than clear. Alicia had forced the department to confront a troubling pattern. Dozens of old complaints resurfaced, dusty files pulled from cabinets and electronic archives. Citizens who had been brushed aside now felt emboldened to speak again. Men and women came forward with eerily similar stories. Traffic stops turned hostile, fabricated charges, intimidation tactics, and reports that mysteriously disappeared once they reached the hands of certain supervisors, Bradley told himself. It was just noise, that nothing would come of it. He had survived rumors before, survived complaints, survived investigations that always ended in his favor. But this time was different. This time, Alicia's trial had cracked something open that couldn't be sealed shut. The press had caught wind of the verdict, and local journalists began digging. Headlines appeared questioning police accountability, and Bradley's name was at the center of every story. Alicia returned to her hospital shifts, where patients and co-workers alike treated her with newfound respect. They saw her not only as a nurse, but as a symbol of resilience. Yet she never wore her victory like armor. She still walked cautiously at night, still double-checked her locks, still felt the lingering anxiety of being targeted by someone in power. The scars of that night in the parking lot ran deep, but she carried them quietly, determined not to let fear rule her life. One evening, after a long day at work, she sat on her balcony watching the sun dip below the horizon. The city seemed calmer, the air lighter, but she couldn't shake the thought that Bradley wasn't finished. Men like him rarely surrendered gracefully. She wondered if he would try to retaliate, if his bruised ego would push him into reckless choices. But then she reminded herself he wasn't the untouchable figure he once was. The world had seen through his mask now, and that truth had power. Bradley, meanwhile, spiraled. He drank more than usual, slamming bottles down in the kitchen of his empty apartment. The framed commendations on his wall mocked him now, each one a reminder of a man he had pretended to be. He replayed the trial in his head, convinced that Alicia's lawyer had tricked the jury, that the judge had been biased, that the system he once controlled had turned against him. But beneath the anger, a gnawing fear grew. What if they were finally going to hold him accountable? The inquiry intensified. Officers were interviewed, body cam archives reviewed, and whispers of corruption grew louder. Bradley's supervisors, once his shield, began to distance themselves. Procedural review, they called it, but Bradley knew better. He was being cornered, abandoned, left to face the storm alone, and the storm broke sooner than he expected. One morning, he arrived at the precinct to find two men in suits waiting by his desk. Internal Affairs. Their faces were unreadable, their tone clipped and professional. Officer Bradley, you're placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of this investigation. His badge and gun were taken from him, the weight of authority stripped away in a matter of seconds. He felt naked without them, humiliated as fellow officers watched in silence. The news spread fast. Some officers muttered that it was overdue. Others grumbled about politics, but none stepped forward to defend him. Bradley had built his career on fear and dominance, not loyalty or camaraderie. With the foundation crumbling, he realized just how alone he was. Alicia learned of his suspension through a news broadcast. She sat on the edge of her couch, listening as reporters outlined the investigation into misconduct, patterns of abuse, and possible criminal charges. She exhaled slowly, feeling both relief and sorrow. Relief because justice seemed closer than ever. Sorrow because it had taken so many victims. So many years for the truth to finally pierce the shield of his badge. Still, Alicia refused to let bitterness consume her. She chose instead to see hope. The hope that change was possible, that voices once silenced could now be heard. She thought of the other victims who had stepped forward, felt proud that her courage had helped open that door for them. But Bradley's downfall was not swift. He fought every step of the way. He hired lawyers, gave interviews insisting he was the victim of a witch hunt, claimed the media had twisted the story. Yet the evidence kept piling higher. Body cam recordings contradicted his reports. Citizens' testimonies overlapped in disturbing consistency. Even officers quietly admitted that his behavior had long been problematic. The city grew restless as the investigation dragged on. Protests filled the streets, some demanding accountability, others defending law enforcement as a whole. Alicia marched quietly among the first group, not shouting slogans, but holding a sign that read, "Truth Matters." She felt the weight of eyes on her, but unlike before, she no longer shrank from it. Months later, the final blow came. Bradley was officially terminated from the force. The department released a statement about integrity, accountability, and restoring public trust. To Bradley, the words were hollow, an insult. To Alicia, they were a small but meaningful step forward. Yet the story didn't end there. Civil suits followed, criminal investigations loomed, and Bradley found himself drowning in legal battles. His savings dwindled, his reputation shattered. His name spoken only in the context of disgrace. On the night the announcement aired, Alicia once again sat on her balcony, watching the city lights flicker. She thought of the journey, the fear, the trial, the truth that finally emerged. She didn't feel triumphant so much as steady, grounded, resolved. She had faced the storm and survived, and in surviving, she had changed the course of her community's story. Bradley, sitting alone in his dim apartment, stared at the badge he had been forced to surrender, now sitting useless on the table. For years, it had been his shield, his weapon, his mask. Now it was nothing but metal and memory. He picked it up, turning it over in his hand, and for the first time, he saw not power, but the wreckage of every choice he had made. The city moved. On. Alicia continued her work, tending to patients, comforting families, saving lives in quiet defiance of the pain she had endured. She became a symbol not because she sought it, but because truth has a way of shining through, even in the darkest. Corners and Bradley faded into obscurity. His name whispered only as a cautionary tale of arrogance, corruption, and the inevitable collapse of false power. Alicia knew the scars would never fully fade, but she also knew they didn't define her. What defined her was the courage to stand, the strength to endure, and the truth that had finally, undeniably, prevailed.